Section 1 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 3, Ancient Achievements. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Beacon Lights of History, Volume 3, Ancient Achievements by John Lord. Governments and Laws, Part 1. Greek and Roman Jurisprudence, 624 B.C. through 550 A.D. There is not much in ancient governments and laws to interest us, except such as were in harmony with natural justice, and were designed for the welfare of all classes in the state. A jurisprudence founded on the edicts of absolute kings or on the regulations of a priestly caste is necessarily partial and may be unenlightened. But those laws which are gradually enacted for the interests of the whole body of the people, for the rich and poor, the powerful and feeble alike, have generally been the result of great and diversive experiences, running through centuries, the work of wise men, and under constitutional forms of government. The jurisprudence of nations based on equity is a growth or development according to public wants and necessities, especially in countries having popular liberty and rights, as in England and the United States. We do not find in the history of ancient nations such a jurisprudence, except in the free states of Greece and among the Romans, who had a natural genius or aptitude for government, and where the people had a powerful influence in legislation, until even the name of liberty was not invoked. Among the Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, the only laws were the edicts of kings or the regulations of priests, mostly made with a view of cementing their own power, except those that were dictated by benevolence or the pressing needs of the people, and protected only as slaves were once protected in the southern states of America. Wise and good monarchs doubtless issued decrees for the benefit of all classes, such as conscience or knowledge dictated, whenever they felt their great responsibilities, as in some of the absolute monarchies of Europe. But they never issued their decrees at the suggestions or demands of those classes for whom the laws were made. The voice of the people was ignored, except so far as it moved the pity or appealed to the hearts and consciences of their rulers. The people had and claimed no rights. The only men to whom rulers listened or by whom they were controlled were those whom they chose as counselors and ministers, who were supposed to advise with a view to the sovereign's benefit and that of the empire generally. The same may be said in general of other Oriental monarchies, especially when embarked in aggressive wars, where the will of the monarch was supreme and unresisted, as in Persia. In India and China the government was not so absolute, since it was checked by feudatory princes, almost independent like the feudal barons and dukes of mediaeval Europe. Nor was there probably among Oriental nations any elaborate codification of the decrees and laws as in Greece and Rome, except by the priests for their ritual service, like that which marked the jurisprudence of the Israelites. There were laws against murder, theft, adultery, and other offenses, since society cannot exist anywhere without such laws; but there was no complicated jurisprudence produced by the friction of competing classes striving for justice and right, or even for the interests of contending parties. We do not look to Egypt or to China for wise punishment of ordinary crimes, but we do look to Greece and Rome, and to Rome especially, for a legislation which shall balance the complicated relations of society on principles of enlightened reason. Moreover, those great popular rights which we now most zealously defend have generally been extorted in the strife of classes and parties, sometimes from kings and sometimes from princes and nobles. Where there has been no opposition to absolutism, these rights have not been secured. But whenever and wherever the people have been a power, they have imperiously made their wants known, and so far as they have been reasonable they have been finally secured, perhaps after angry expostulations and disputations. Now it is this kind of legislation which is remarkable in the history of Greece and Rome, secured by a combination of the people against the ruling classes in the interests of justice and the common welfare, and finally endorsed and upheld even by monarchs themselves. It is from this legislation that modern nations have learned wisdom; for a permanent law in a free country may be the result of 100 years of discussion or contention, a compromise of parties, a lesson in human experience. As the laws of Greece and Rome alone among the ancients are rich in moral wisdom and adapted more or less to all nations and ages in the struggle for equal rights and wise social regulations, I shall confine myself to them. Besides, I aim not to give useless and curious details, but to show how far in general the enlightened nations of antiquity made attainments in those things which we call civilization, and particularly in that great department which concerns so nearly all human interests, that of the regulation of mutual social relations, and this by modes and with results which have had their direct influence upon our modern times. When we consider the native genius of the Greeks, and their marvellous achievements in philosophy, literature, and art, we are surprised that they were so inferior to the Romans in jurisprudence, although in the early days of the Roman Republic a deputation of citizens was sent to Athens to study the laws of Solon. But neither nations nor individuals are great in everything. Before Solon lived, Lycurgus had given laws to the Spartans. This lawgiver, one of the descendants of Hercules, was born, according to Grote, about 880 years before Christ, and was the uncle of the reigning king. There is, however, no certainty as to the time when he lived. It was probably about the period when Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians. He instituted the Spartan Senate, and gave an aristocratic form to the constitution. But the Senate, composed of about 30 old men who acted in conjunction with the two kings, did not differ materially from the council of chiefs or old men found in other ancient Grecian states. The Spartan chiefs simply modified or curtailed the power of the kings. In the course of time the Senate, with the kings included in it, became the governing body of the state, and this oligarchical form of government lasted several hundred years. We know but little of the especial laws given by Lycurgus. We know the distinctions of society, citizens and helots and their mutual relations, the distribution of lands to check luxury, the public men, the public training of youth, the severe discipline to which all were subjected, the cruelty exercised toward slaves, the attention given to gymnastic exercises and athletic sports, in short, the habits and customs of the people rather than any regular system of jurisprudence. Lycurgus was the trainer of a military brotherhood rather than a lawgiver. Under his regime, the citizen belonged to the state rather than to his family, and all the ends of the state were warlike rather than peaceful, not looking to the settlement of quarrels on principles of equity, or development of industrial interests, which are the great aims of modern legislation. The influence of the Athenian Solon on the laws which affected individuals is more apparent than that of the Spartan Lycurgus, the earliest of Grecian legislators. But Solon had a predecessor in Athens itself, Draco, who in 624 was appointed to reduce to writing the arbitrary decisions of the archons, thus giving a form of permanent law and a basis for a court of appeal. Draco's laws were extraordinarily severe, punishing small thefts and even laziness with death. The formulation of any system of justice would have, as Draco's did, a beneficial influence on the growth of the state, but the severity of these bloody laws caused them to be hated and in practice neglected until Solon arose. Solon was born in Athens about 638 B.C., and belonged to the noblest family of the state. He was a contemporary with Pisistratus and Thales. His father having lost his property, Solon applied himself to merchandise, always a respectable calling in a mercantile city. He first became known as a writer of love poems, then came into prominence as a successful military commander of volunteer forces in a disastrous war, and at last he gained the confidence of his countrymen so completely that in a period of anarchy, distress, and mutiny, the poor being so grievously oppressed by the rich that a sixth part of the produce of the land went to the landlord, he was chosen archon, with authority to revise the laws, and might have made himself king. He abolished the custom of selling the body of a debtor for debt, and even annulled debts in a state of general distress, which did not please the rich nor even the poor, since they desired a redivision of lands such as Lycurgus had made in Sparta. He repealed the severe laws of Draco, which inflicted capital punishment for so many small offences, retaining the extreme penalty only for murder and treason. In order further to promote the interests of the people, he empowered any man whatever to enter an action for one that was injured. He left the great offices of state, however, in the hands of the rich, giving the people a share in those which were not so important. He reestablished the council of the Areopagus, composed of those who had been archons, and 9 were appointed annually for the general guardianship of the laws. But he instituted another court or senate of 400 citizens for the cognizance of all matters before they were submitted to the higher court. Although the poorest and most numerous class were not eligible for office, they had the right of suffrage, and could vote for the principal officers. It would at first seem that the legislation of Solon gave especial privileges to the rich, but it is generally understood that he was the founder of the democracy of Athens. He gave the Athenians, not the best possible code, but the best they were capable of receiving. He intended to give to the people as much power as was strictly needed, and no more. But in a free state the people continually encroach on the privileges of the rich, and thus gradually the chief power falls into their hands. Whatever the power which Solon gave to the people, and however great their subsequent encroachments, it cannot be doubted that he was the first to lay the foundations of constitutional government, that is, one in which the people took part in legislation and the election of rulers. The greatest benefit which he conferred on the State was in the laws which gave relief to poor debtors, those which enabled people to protect themselves by constitutional means, and those which prohibited fathers from selling their daughters and sisters for slaves, an abomination which had long disgraced the Athenian Republic. Some of Solon's laws were of questionable utility. He prohibited the exportation of the fruits of the soil in Attica, with the exception of olive oil alone, a regulation difficult to be enforced in a mercantile state. Neither would he grant citizenship to immigrants, and he released sons from supporting their parents in old age if the parents had neglected to give them a trade. He encouraged all developments of national industries, knowing that the wealth of the State depended on them. Solon was the first Athenian legislator who granted the power of testamentary bequests when a man had no legitimate children. Sons succeeded to the property of their parents, with the obligation of giving a marriage dowry to their sisters. If there were no sons, the daughters inherited the property of their parents; but a person who had no children could bequeath his property to whom he pleased. Solon prohibited costly sacrifices at funerals. He forbade evil speaking of the dead, and indeed of all persons before judges and archons. He pronounced a man infamous who took part in a sedition. When this enlightened and disinterested man had finished his work of legislation, 494 B.C., he visited Egypt and Cyprus, and devoted his leisure to the composition of poems. He also, it is said, when a prisoner in the hands of the Persians, visited Croesus, the rich king of Lydia, and gave to him an admonitory lesson on the vicissitudes of life. After a prolonged absence, Solon returned to Athens about the time of the usurpation of his kinsman Pisistratus, 560 B.C., who, however, suffered the aged legislator and patriot to go unharmed, and even allowed most of his laws to remain in force. The constitution and laws of Athens continued substantially for about 100 years after the archonship of Solon, when the democratic party under Clisthenes gained complete ascendency. Some modification of the laws was then made. The political franchise was extended to all free native Athenians. The command of the military forces was given to 10 generals, one from each tribe, instead of being entrusted to one of the archons. The ecclesia, a formal assembly of the citizens, met more frequently. The people were called into direct action as dicasts, or jurors. All citizens were eligible to the magistracy, even to the archonship. Ostracism, which virtually was exile without disgrace, became a political necessity to check the ascendency of demagogues. Such were the main features of the constitution and jurisprudence of Athens when the struggle between the patricians and plebeians of Rome began, to which we now give our attention. It was the real beginning of the constitutional liberty in Rome. Before this time the government was in the hands of either kings or aristocrats. The patricians were descendants of the original Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan families. The plebeians were the throng of common folk brought in by conquest or later immigration, mostly of Latin origin. The Senate was the ruling power after the expulsion of the kings, and senators were selected from the great patrician families, who controlled by their wealth and influence the popular elections, the army and navy, and all foreign relations. Consuls, the highest magistrates, who commanded the armies, were annually elected by the people, but for several centuries the consuls belonged to great families. The constitution was essentially aristocratic, and the aristocracy was based on wealth. Power was in the hands of the nobles, whether their ancestors were patricians or plebeians, although in the early ages of the Republic they were mostly patricians by birth. But with the growth of Rome, new families that were not descended from the ancient tribes became prominent, like the Claudii, the Julii, and the Servilii, and were incorporated with the nobility. There were very few names in Roman history before the time of Marius which did not belong to the noble class. The plebes, or common people, had at first no political privileges whatever, not even the right of suffrage, and were not allowed to marry into patrician rank. Indeed, they were politically and socially oppressed. The first great event which gave the plebes protection and political importance was the appointment of representatives called tribunes of the people, a privilege extorted from the patricians. The tribunes had the right to be present at the deliberations of the Senate; their persons were inviolable, and they had the power of veto over obnoxious laws. Their power continually increased, until they were finally elected from the senatorial body. In 421 B.C. the plebes had gained sufficient influence to establish the connubium, by which they were allowed to intermarry with patricians. In the same year they were admitted into the quaestorship, which office entitled the possessor to a seat in the Senate. The quaestors had charge of the public money. In 336 B.C. the plebeians obtained the praetorship, a judicial office. In the year 286 B.C. the distinctions vanished between plebeians and patricians, and the term populace instead of plebes was applied to all Roman people alike. Originally the populace comprised strictly Roman citizens, those who belonged to the original tribes, and those who had the right of suffrage. When the plebeians obtained access to the great offices of the state, the Senate represented the whole people as it formerly represented the populace, and the term populace was enlarged to embrace the entire community. The Senate was an august body and was very powerful. It was both judicial and legislative, and for several centuries was composed of patricians alone. Its members always belonged to the aristocracy, whether of patrician or plebeian descent, and were supposed to be rich. Under Augustus it required 1,200,000 sesterces annually to support the senatorial dignity. The Senate, the members of which were chosen for life, had the superintendence of matters of religion and foreign relations. It commanded the levies of troops, it regulated duties and taxes, it gave audience to ambassadors. It determined upon the way that war should be conducted, it decreed to what provinces governors should be sent, it declared martial law in the appointment of dictators, and it decreed triumphs to fortunate generals. The senators, as a badge of distinction, wore upon their tunics a broad purple stripe, and they had the privilege of the best seats in the theatres. Their decisions were laws, leges. A large part of them had held curule offices, which entitled them to a seat in the Senate for life. The curule offices were the consuls, the praetors, the aediles, the quaestors, the tribunes, so that an able senator was sure of a great office in the course of his life. A man could scarcely be a senator unless he had held a great office, nor could he often have held a great office unless he were a senator. Thus it would seem that the Roman constitution for 300 years after the expulsion of the kings was essentially aristocratic. The plebes had but small consideration until the time of Gracchi. But after the institution of tribunes, a change in the constitution gradually took place, so that it was neither aristocratic nor popular exclusively, but was composed of both elements, and was a system of balance of power between the various classes. The more complete the balance of power, the closer is the resemblance to a constitutional government. When one class acted as a check against another class, as gradually came to pass, until the subversion of liberties by successful generals, the Senate, the magistrates, and the people in their assemblies shared between them the political power, but the Senate had a preponderating influence. The judicial, the legislative, and the executive authority was as well defined in Roman legislation as it is in English or American. No person was above the authority of the laws; no one class could subvert the liberties and prerogatives of another class; even the Senate could not override the Constitution. The consuls, elected by the centuries, presided over the Senate and over the assemblies of the people. There was no absolute power exercised at Rome until the subversion of the Constitution, except by dictators chosen by the Senate in times of imminent danger. Nor could senators elect members of their own body; the censors alone had the right of electing from the ex-magistrates, and of excluding such as were unworthy. The consuls could remain in office but a year, and could be called to account when their terms of office had expired. The tribunes of the people ultimately could prevent a consul from convening the Senate, could seize a consul and imprison him, and could veto an ordinance of the Senate itself. The nobles had no exclusive privilege like the feudal aristocracy of Mediaeval Europe, although it was their aim to secure the high magistracies to the members of their own body. The term nobilitas implied that some one of a man's ancestors had filled a curule magistracy. A patrician, long before the reforms of the Gracchi, had become a man of secondary importance, but the nobles were aristocrats to the close of the Republic, and continued to secure the highest offices; they prevented their own extinction by admitting into their ranks those who distinguished themselves, that is, exercising their influence in the popular elections to secure the magistracies from among themselves. End of Section 1.